Okay, welcome to another episode of Fun with Maps. This is going to be a fun one. I'm your host, Dan Hanson. You can see I'm wearing a rugby jersey today. That's in honor of the topic of this episode of Fun with Maps, New Zealand. Back in the day, I used to play some rugby, and my favorite team was always the New Zealand All Blacks. They're the National Rugby Union team. I think they've won the most matches in rugby union history. They've won the World Cup 3 times. A lot of fun to watch, really talented, fun teams. One of the best parts is they do the Haka before a match. So the Maori people of New Zealand had a dance called the Haka, and you'll see it in a rugby match. The two teams will line up from each other before the game, and when the New Zealand All Blacks do their Haka, it's very intimidating. They have coordinated foot gestures, they stomp, they yell stuff. It's really cool to watch and intimidating for the other team. It's a lot of fun, and it's part of what makes the New Zealand All Blacks rugby experience fun. We're going to look at the Haka a little more in detail when we get to the computer. Right now, let's zoom in and get some of the basics of New Zealand on the map here. Okay, so I don't have a good map of New Zealand or Oceana or this area here, but you can see here on the world map the various continents: North and South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, got Australia, and down here this area they call Oceana. We'll talk about that, but this down here is New Zealand, so it's about as far away as you can get from where I am. Here's New Zealand. Let me zoom in a little on that. So here you can see Australia. Familiar with that. We had the Fun with Maps episode about Indonesia. That's up here. New Zealand's down here. It's got 2 land masses, cleverly named North Island and South Island. Okay, so there's the North Island, there's the South Island. It's also got about 600 smaller islands around it. They cover a total area of about 103,000 miles. That's about twice the size of North Carolina. It's about the size of Colorado. Okay. Here's the Tasman Sea. So New Zealand is separated from Australia. You've heard of Tasmanian devils and Tasmania and all that. Here's the Tasman Sea. New Zealand is separated from Australia by about 1,200 miles here across the Tasman Sea. And up here you've got the islands of New Caledonia and Fiji. Here's Samoa, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, which we've seen with Indonesia and all. So it's kind of remote and isolated down there. Remember in the Fun with Maps episode about Indonesia, just here we talked about the Ring of Fire. Well, New Zealand is in that Ring of Fire as well. The Ring of Fire, to refresh your memory, it's a belt of active volcanoes and earthquake epicenters in the Pacific Ocean here. And up to 90% of the world's earthquakes and about 75% of the world's volcanoes occur within this Ring of Fire. So with New Zealand in there, when we look at its topography and the mountains and the sharp mountain peaks and all that, including the southern Alps, much of that is from the tectonic uplift and volcanic eruptions because it's in this Ring of Fire. Okay. So the population of New Zealand is about, it's under 5 million, it's about 4.92 million. That's about the size of population of South Carolina, to give you some perspective. There's a lot to cover New Zealand. You know that the Lord of the Rings was filmed there. The amazing scenery you saw in all the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit movies, that's New Zealand. There's some confusion about Oceana, whether that's a continent, whether New Zealand's a part of it, all of that stuff. We'll look at the Maori people and some really fun and interesting facts, including a recent discovery. Some map work actually, some new maps have revealed a continent called Zealandia. Zealandia is a lost continent beneath New Zealand. So with some of these volcanic and tectonic eruptions over the years, there's a continent under New Zealand, and there's some new maps that really show that well. So my sister Debbie, who gave me this pointer, She visited New Zealand years ago. She was amazed by just the natural beauty, and it's really it's an incredible place on the planet, very unique. I've only met a few people from New Zealand, but they are some of the most fun people I've ever met. Maybe because it was after rugby games or something like that, but they were a blast. And so a visit to New Zealand is definitely on my bucket list. So let's get into this episode of Fun with Maps. There's a lot to cover. This episode is about New Zealand. Okay, so here's a map, CIA map actually. Here's Australia, here's Southeast Asia, Indonesia, here's New Zealand down here. Here's some of the islands. Here's New Zealand. This is an area called Oceana. Okay, Oceana is a geographic region. It includes Australasia, Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia. It spans both the eastern and western hemispheres. It's about 3.2 million square miles. It has about 41 million people. Okay, that's Oceana. When you compare it to continents, though, like North America, South America, and so on, it's the smallest in land area and second smallest in population after Antarctica. So let me pull up this great image. This is by a user called Tint Azul Derivative of the UN's. This is the UN's regional scheme of Oceana. So thank you, Tint Azul. Here you see, okay, there's Asia. Here's Micronesia up here. And it's got the Marianas and the Marshall Islands in here. Here's Australasia, basically Australia. Here's Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, New Caledonia, all that. Here's Polynesia. It's got Hawaii up here, the Pitcairn Islands, the Cook Islands, American Samoa, Tuvalu. That's Polynesia. Notice New Zealand is here all by itself. Okay, so you've got some pretty high economic developed areas like Australia and New Zealand and Oceania. You got some, Fiji and Tonga, they're kind of moderate. But then you got some that aren't as developed, like Tuvalu and Kiribati. So Oceania is pretty diverse. Here's a Fun with Maps fun fact. Tuvalu, which is here, it's only got about 10,000 people, okay? But you've probably heard of it in some way, because it's best known for its top-level internet domain suffix. So just like the US, we use .com, in Canada it's .ca, New Zealand has .nz, Tuvalu has .tv, which has become a large revenue generator for companies to, lease domain names that end in .tv. So you could have like NBC.tv or LawandOrder.tv or something like that. So that's pretty cool about Tuvalu. So here's a map from ULANWP, ULANWP. Thank you for that. And you can see, because they're so remote, the islands of New Zealand were the last large habitable lands to be settled by humans. So between about 1280 and 1350, Polynesians began to settle in the islands, and they developed a distinctive Maori culture. Now, we talked about the Maoris with the Haka dance. So the first settlers of Australia and New Guinea and the large islands just to the east arrived more than 60,000 years ago. So Oceania, this whole area, was first explored by Europeans, the Dutch and Portuguese and all, from the 16th century onward. In the 18th century, James Cook, who later, he came here to Hawaii, which was pretty much developed at the time. James Cook first went to Tahiti and followed the east coast of Australia for the first time. So you've all heard about James Cook. So you can see here how people came, various societies, and with New Zealand being so remote, they were pretty much last on the list. So when we look at a map of New Zealand, and this is a CIA map, you'll see it's basically, there's two major islands and an additional chain of about 600 smaller islands. So here's the North Island to the north, here's the South Island to the south. Imagine that. So it's really isolated though from other land masses. So in between here is the Cook Strait. That's what connects them there. The whole country of New Zealand is located almost at the center of the water hemisphere. So this southern island is the 12th largest island in the world, and it's got the southern Alps, which are this huge, beautiful mountain range. It's got 18 peaks. They're all over 3,000 meters above sea level. So that's there in the South Island here. The capital here is Wellington. So it's right at the Cook Strait here, in between. It's in the north, but it's between north and south, really close there. Wellington is the southernmost national capital in the world. And up here is Auckland, which you may have heard of. That's the most populous city in New Zealand. That's Auckland. Let's see. So here's a picture of Auckland at night, seen from one of their tall towers. It's home to almost a third of the country's population up here on the North Island. So that's Auckland, and it looks like, you know, any other modern day city. So let's get some kind of perspective there. If you place New Zealand over here on the east coast of the US, so this in orange here, this is New Zealand. So you can see here we down in Florida, go through Georgia and South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, all the way up, and maybe reach Erie up here. But that's about the comparative size of New Zealand to the in the United States here. So I told you about the Haka when I talked about the rugby team, the All Blacks. So the Haka is a traditional dance of the Maori people. The ceremony, it's an ancient Maori tradition. Basically, they wanted to determine if visitors came in peace or with hostile intent. You've got to search on YouTube for Haka to see it and watch it. It's really cool to watch. It's Haka, you can't miss it. So the Maori, here's a picture of actually when a U.S. official came to New Zealand, they performed this Haka to welcome him. So the Maori, M-A-O-R-I, they're the indigenous Polynesian people of mainland New Zealand. They came from eastern Polynesia. They came in several waves of canoes, which they call waka, roughly between 1320 and 1350. So over several centuries in isolation, because they are remote, these settlers developed their own distinctive culture, language, myths, crafts, and their arts, and they developed independently from other Eastern Polynesian cultures. So here's the Haka is one of those things that developed independently. Here's a picture from 1642. It's the first European impression of Maori at what was then called Murderer's Bay. It was in Abel Tasman's travel journal in 1642. So you heard that name Tasman. We saw the Tasman Sea. You've heard of Tasmania, the Tasmanian Devil, all that. So the first European explorers to New Zealand were Abel Tasman, who arrived in 1642. You know about Captain James Cook, 1769, and someone named Marion Dufresne in 1772. So when the Europeans came, you know, it's very similar to what happened in North America. There's a sharing of culture and ideas. Many Maori valued the Europeans. They called them pakia, and they started to acquire Western technology and knowledge. They actually had a oral tradition for their stories, but they learned writing, and they started converting their oral stories and poems to the written form to share their ideas. Another thing that revolutionized things in New Zealand was the introduction of the potato. That revolutionized agriculture there. On the other hand, they were also introduced to muskets, and that led to a period of particularly bloody intertribal warfare known as the Musket Wars. Some groups were just decimated, and others were driven out from their traditional territory. And just like in other places, the Maori suffered high mortality rates from Eurasian infectious diseases, influenza, smallpox, measles. You know, it killed 10 to 50% of the Maori. So there were, you know, up and down relationships between the Europeans and the Maori. In 1840, they signed the Treaty of Waitangi, signed by the British English crown and 500 Maori chiefs. It gave the Maori the rights of British subjects and guaranteed their property rights and tribal autonomy, and in return they accepted British sovereignty and that New Zealand would be annexed as a colony of the British Empire. Of course, things like that don't last, and there were land conflicts and social upheaval and diseases, and the Maori population started to really drop. So there was a recovery period in the 20th century. There have been efforts made to increase their standing in wider New Zealand society and achieve some social justice. Any of this sound familiar? Okay. There was a Maori protest movement in the 1960s, and they're trying to close the gap between Maori and other New Zealanders. So in the 2018 census, there were about 16.5% of the national population identified as Maori. It's the second largest ethnic group in New Zealand after the European New Zealanders, or they call them the Pakeha. And there's another 140,000 Maori that live in Australia. And the Maori language is spoken by about a fifth of all Maori, and they're active in every sphere of New Zealand society. So very important part of New Zealand is the Maori culture. So here's a picture taken by Matt Bolton, Boulton. Thanks, Matt. It's a sign in the village of Matamata in New Zealand, where some of the film trilogy of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbits was shot. So a lot of people call New Zealand Middle Earth, because of The Lord of the Ring and The Hobbit trilogies. The director was Peter Jackson, of course, and he was born in New Zealand. So he filmed the entire 6 films there in various locations around New Zealand. He lives there. His companies are in the capital city of Wellington. In fact, they call it Wellywood, like Hollywood. And his film company, 3 Foot 6, is there too. So they scoured New Zealand, and if you saw the movies, you saw all those amazing, beautiful and diverse areas that looked like, Middle Earth. So the rolling hills of Matamata, for example, became Hobbit Town. The volcanic region of Mount Rupahu transformed into Mount Doom, where Sauron forged the ring. And Queenstown, New Zealand's adventure capital, was the setting for numerous scenes, including the Egregion Hills and the Pillars of Argonath. So if you ever watch The Lord of the Rings again or the Hobbit movies, pay particular attention to some of the scenery and know that that's all New Zealand. So here's one of those stunning pictures. This is Milford Sound, some of the cliffs. It's a fjord located in the Fjordland National Park in the South Island. It's a must-see spot. In fact, in 2008, Milford Sound was judged the world's top travel destination in an international trip advisory survey. World's top travel destination, Milford Sound here in the South Island. That's amazing. Here's a Fun with Maps fun fact. Rudyard Kipling, he once called Milford Sound the 8th wonder of the world. So, as a fjord, Milford Sound was formed by a process of glaciation over millions of years. Remember what a fjord is? In geology, a fjord is a long, narrow inlet with steep sides or cliffs, and it's created by a glacier. Okay? So that's Milford Sound. So Milford Sound runs about 15 kilometers inland from the Tasman Sea, which we saw is between Australia and New Zealand, and it's surrounded by sheer rock faces that rise, 4,000 feet or more on either side. One of the peaks here, it's about 5,000 feet, is, you guessed it, the Elephant. And obviously that looks like an elephant. Here's the trunk. Here's the legs. That's the elephant. Okay. It's got 2 permanent waterfalls. Only about 120 people live in Milford Sound, and they're basically working tourism or conservation. There's another fjord in there on the far southwest side of New Zealand called Doubtful Sound. It took second place after Milford Sound as New Zealand's most famous tourism destination. Here's a quick Fun with Maps geography update. Do you remember the difference between a fjord and a sound? Basically, a sound is created by a river, while a fjord is created by a glacier. So, for basics, that's all you really need to know. Fjord is created by a glacier, a sound is created by a river. So Long Island Sound or Puget Sound, and even though this is called Doubtful Sound or Milford Sound, they're actually, because they're formed by glaciers, they're fjords. So you probably know that Kiwi is the nickname used internationally for people from New Zealand, and there's no derogatory connotation at all. They view it as a symbol of pride and endearment for people in New Zealand. Of course, it comes from the Kiwi bird, a native flightless bird, which is their national symbol. And really, until the First World War, the Kiwi represented the country of New Zealand and not the people. But then the Kiwi, by 1917, New Zealanders were also being called Kiwis, and that supplanted any other nicknames. Before we finish this episode of Fun with Maps and talk about the Lost Continent, let me share a few Fun with Maps fun facts about New Zealand. So, New Zealand has only one native mammal. It's a bat the size of your thumb. They got a lot of birds like kiwi and the weekend, cockapoo and stuff, but they're flightless. And the reason is there were no large land predators to endanger them because they were so isolated there, which blows my mind. So, but when Europeans arrived, all of a sudden there were invasive species like possums and rabbits and all that threatened some of the native birds, which now some of them are endangered. So another fun fact, with about 4 million people in New Zealand, there's about 30 million sheep. So there's sheep farms all over the country, and because of that, you're going to find a lot of lamb and mutton on every menu, and even the local subways have lamb and mutton sandwiches. The $5 bill of New Zealand features Sir Edmund Hillary. Yep, the first man to summit Mount Everest. He was a Kiwi. Other famous people from New Zealand include actors Russell Crowe and Sam Neill and Anna Paquin. And of course, we talked about director Peter Jackson. New Zealand was the first country to give women the right to vote. They did it in 1893. And the country's most famous suffragette, a lady named Kate Shepherd, is on New Zealand's $10 bill. So where it's located, the town of Gisborne on New Zealand's east coast is said to be the first city to see sunrise each day. So that's pretty cool. But let's wrap this up with the Lost Continent. So there's this lost continent, they call it the New Zealand continent or Tasmantis, but it's really caught on as Zealandia. It's an almost entirely submerged mass of continental crust. It broke away from Gondwanaland like 80 million years ago. It's been called a continental fragment, a microcontinent, a submerged continent, a lost continent, all of that stuff. So here we've got New Zealand, here we've got Australia. All this stuff here underneath is the lost continent of Zealandia. Okay? So it's huge. Most of Zealandia is underwater. Ball's Pyramid near Lord Howe Island is one place where it rises above sea level. So you got this huge mass here underneath the sea. And then we have occasionally we'll have part of it. This is Ball's Pyramid near Lord Howe Island, where part of Zealandia rises above the sea. So just recently in the news, we've been hearing some new discoveries because of technology and mapping. We can get a lot more information. Scientists have known about this lost continent under the surface of the ocean there. But Zealandia, with the new technology, many are calling it Earth's eighth continent. You see, it's 94% underwater. It's the planet's youngest, smallest, thinnest, most submerged continent. So, here's Australia, Tasman Sea, and the green here is New Zealand. All of this stuff underwater is Zealandia. Okay? That's all underwater. 94% of it is underwater. So what scientists are saying what happened, there was this supercontinent, vast supercontinent of Gondwana land, okay? And it broke up into 5 continent-sized pieces. It created South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, Australia, and Zealandia. And this happened progressively from 150 to 50 million years ago, you know, like a reverse jigsaw puzzle, but they've left clues and geologists are starting to find this. So about 100 million years ago, the tectonic situation changed again, and Gondwana stretched and rifted and eventually separated off a large fragment that became Zealandia. So you always see the map of the world where it looks like South America can fit into Africa and all that. That was all part of Gondwana land. So first it was all land, but then it started slowly sank. The Tasman Sea here grew, and it continued to be stretched and thinned until about 25 million years ago was mostly under the sea. So now we have this new technology, though, that it's giving us better maps. You know, we can see things like this, and it's going to give us start to demystify this new map of Zealandia. So we've got New Zealand here, but just underneath it is this huge area, the 8th continent on the earth, called Zealandia. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Fun with Maps on New Zealand as much as I did. You know, one more Fun with Maps fact: there's no snakes. Much like Hawaii, there's no snakes in New Zealand. There's no deadly spiders. There's no killer jellyfish or a lot of those creepy crawly things that can kill you. Their neighbor Australia's got all those things. So New Zealand is devoid of that. That's another reason to visit there. Like I said, New Zealand's high on my bucket list. I really want to get there. It's about as far away from where I live as you can get. It's the Kiwis say in their language that it's out in the wops, W-O-P-S. That means it's a place in the middle of nowhere, far from anything. To us, it's out in the wops. To them, of course, it's home. So between the Lord of the Rings scenery, the rugby, the Maori people, all that stuff, it adds up to what I think will be a great trip. I remember being in a bar after a rugby game with some people from New Zealand, and you know, when someone's drinking, you'll hear in the States will say drink, drink, drink. Well, their Kiwi expression, instead of saying drink, 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 they were yelling, skull it now, skull, skull, skull. So if you're in a bar sometime and you see people drinking, try the Kiwi cheer of skull, skull, skull instead of drink, and see what kind of reaction you get. So until your next time, I'm your host, Dan Hanson, and keep having fun with maps.